I'm adding a magical dimension to Minecraft, reached through witchcraft and filled with a mysterious aura. From bubbling rivers winding through dense, foggy forests, join me as we leave the overworld and make our way into the witch realm. I have a lot of ideas for this witch dimension, but when coming up with a new dimension, I find it easiest to first consider the terrain. Terrain can mean a lot of things in practice, not least of which is the actual physical block that the bulk of the dimension will be made out of. For the overworld, this is stone, and then it uses surface rules to convert into deep slate before eventually converting to bedrock at the very bottom of the world. For my witch dimension, I think I would like the base block, the default block, to be blackstone. It's a nice dark block that's got a very good ground texture, I think, and then a really cool side texture as well for any hills or cliffs that we end up having. It's also fairly brittle, so it's not going to be too difficult to mine, unlike some other dark blocks like obsidian or even deep slate to a certain extent, which frankly isn't even as dark as I would like it to be for this dimension. And since it's so dark and neutral, I think it'll work really well with a lot of the color schemes that I have in mind for the biomes in this witch dimension. It obviously already has some association with the nether, but since it is used in such small supply there, and I don't plan on having a lot of other nether blocks like netherrack or even magma or lava for that matter, I don't think it'll be too difficult to create a new kind of distinct aesthetic for its usage here in this witch dimension. Now, of course, terrain can mean more than the actual block that the terrain is made up of. It's also the general shape of the terrain, where there is land, where there is oceans or rivers, and where terrain ends up getting higher into hills or eventually mountains. To define this, we use something called density functions. When we create a dimension, we define a noise settings file that dimension uses, which controls a lot of features of the terrain, including the actual shape, but also things like that default block, the sea level, what fluid the sea is made of, and so on. The final density function is ultimately what determines during terrain generation what blocks are solid, what blocks become that default block, either stone or blackstone or whatever you set for it, and what blocks are not solid, either air or water below sea level or where aquifers come in. There's a lot of different configurations you can apply in the noise settings. But specifically when it comes to the final density, we're going to be using splines to determine the rough regions that we want the terrain to slope between oceans, the actual land masses, hills, mountains, just like vanilla does. In vanilla Minecraft, the offset density function includes a spline that basically takes in several noise maps, but chiefly continentalness, the continents noise map, and says, okay, anywhere where the continents noise map, the continents density function is relatively low, that's where terrain should be relatively low. That's where we should get oceans that dip below sea level. And then the sea level obviously fills in all the air that's there with water. Where continents is at its lowest is where we get the mushroom islands way out in the middle of deep oceans, and then as it approaches zero, that's where we start to get rivers and swamps based on several other factors, several other noise maps that get used, and then as it reaches higher than zero, that's where we end up getting terrain, things like hills for these forests, and eventually as continents gets really high, that's where we get big peaks and mountains. I'm going to use ice as my water here to help illustrate, but roughly what I want is mostly a lot of rivers that wind and branch throughout a lot of the terrain that ends up being made of blackstone, these kind of larger islands. They're really not going to be continents, and the rivers ideally are going to be relatively skinny and common enough that they will generally appear pretty much everywhere. You'll always be able to get to a river, but we're not going to have any oceans. It's just going to be these rivers that are breaking up all of these different larger islands of blackstone. So probably based on the ridges noise map that I create, we'll have around zero be where rivers are, very similar to how it works in vanilla Minecraft and the vanilla overworld. But then rather than caring about specifically continents, since we don't really have continents, we don't have oceans in this dimension, we'll instead say, okay, as ridges gets further and further from zero, that's where we end up getting higher terrain, something like maybe some mesas or plateaus, or in some areas maybe like real tall peaks and mountains using a jaggedness spline that will also apply. Doing this right should ultimately result in large regions, large islands that have different terrain on them, separated by these rivers all throughout the dimension, even more so than the rivers that appear here in the overworld. Now, I'm still kind of working out roughly how I want players to be able to engage with this dimension, but I do know for sure that I don't particularly want this to be a dimension that players are mining in. I don't want this to be a big cave dimension or caving dimension where you have to go underground a lot. I want most of the action and activity to be above the surface. And so to help incentivize that, I might as well just remove a lot of the underground. I'll make the bedrock layer at 0 instead of -64 like here in the overworld, but then the actual surface of the terrain where sea level is and things, it's probably going to be around Y30 or something like that. So quite a bit lower than here in the overworld, quite a bit closer to that bedrock. There's not going to be anything down there for them, so the only reason that space exists is if they feel like they want it to build with, which there probably isn't really going to be a lot of purpose for other than just setting up a general base. That was kind of a lot of information and a lot of general ideas, but let's see if I can actually execute on that, and then we can start figuring out how we want the dimension to roughly feel, how we want the biomes to roughly feel, using a lot of the new features that have been added in some recent updates. Okay, so far, we certainly have a successful dimension. We certainly have a dimension that is using Blackstone as the default block, which is of course a great place to start. And from the looks of it, we do have roughly the rivers that I was hoping to see. They're carving through a lot of the terrain here. We're getting a lot of these. This is a small island right here, but we obviously have much larger island regions and some absolutely awesome mountains. That is so cool. This is way more magnificent than I was expecting. I was worrying I was going to get really, really basic kind of mountains, but these are awesome. If these are all over the dimension, it's going to be so cool. We'll fly around a little bit to see, but this is obviously, particularly inland as far, as particular as we can get in a fairly small noise map dimension. My ridges noise map is the same octave as that is used for the overworld, so our rivers are going to be roughly the same density, but that is a smaller octave than the continent's density function use in the vanilla overworld. And since we're using our ridges noise map as the primary determining factor for the general shape and regions of the terrain, that means that the terrain roughly is going to feel a little bit more condensed than in the vanilla overworld. So we're going to get mountains that are generally much closer to rivers, and in this case, usually rivers that are roughly the same size or smaller than the vanilla overworld. Looks like we're approaching, another great mountainous region. That's so cool. I can't believe how tall that is. That's so awesome. Now, mountains aren't the only tall region that we have. It's all that you're going to see on any one given island, but if we go out to a different island, we should be able to see the mesas or plateaus that we have appearing at the low ridges values. This is looking like a pretty good region right here. Obviously not as tall as the peaks, but going from sea level, going from the level of the rivers, we get these nice harsh cliffs that go up onto these sort of mesa plateaus up here. And we get a nice wide region of them here too. We've got a smaller one off over there, nice big long one over here, another kind of medium-sized one. So this whole area is probably going to end up being this plateau or mesa biome, without it all feeling like just one big flat area that is beside the relatively otherwise flat area that the rest of the dimension covers. Now, the terrain is looking good, but obviously the atmosphere here does not really say this is a witch dimension. It is much too bright, much too pleasant, and certainly too much like the overworld, ignoring the Blackstone, of course. Luckily, in the past few updates, Mojang have been adding a lot of configurability, way more than we ever had, for the general feel of a dimension. We can control all kinds of things beyond just the color of the sky and fog based on biome. So to go over my kind of general ideas, I do want this dimension to be relatively dark. I want the sky to look like it is nighttime, probably with stars, which I can control again with these new environment attributes that they've been opening up, and with a moon, but no sun. Despite that, I'll still keep the dimension relatively bright as far as the actual light level that is being attributed to it. We'll still have skylight here because there's no bedrock roof, and it'll probably be light level 15. However, I might make it so that monsters can still spawn regardless of that light level, though I don't know exactly what monsters will be besides witches, and even that I'm not sure on because witches can be a little bit tough in large supply. We can also control the level of fog, both at a biome level and at the dimension level, and so I think we'll probably have a fog that is a little bit more similar to the Nether than it is to the overworld. Right now I'm playing on a render distance 12, so we do have some pretty thick fog at the edge of my render distance here, but the Nether has a much closer and much more significant fog that obscures the horizon that I think I'll probably still have here as well. We might play with that a little bit, especially because I also want it to look good with shaders, which can change how fog appears. And then of course, we always have the ability to control the color of grass, trees, fog, and the sky based on biome as well. And so I'll probably mess with that a little bit, at least for the current broad biome that we have across the full dimension, before we start determining the specific biomes that we have and how we'll fill them, like the plateaus or the mountains. Same thing for the watercolor. That's based on biome as well, and so I'll probably at least make the watercolor for the river biome purple, and we'll see if we change that based on biomes as we add them later. Let's get all that applied and see how it changes just the immediate perception of this witch dimension. Alright, so as I was worried about, we do lose quite a lot of the effect from the shaders. The shaders that I'm using don't seem to use the biome color for the fog, and I also change how the sky looks. So I'm going to go ahead and turn shaders off and see if we get the actual aesthetic that I'm going for. Okay, yes, this is a lot better. We do lose kind of the glow that comes from the rivers here, from the purple water. That, of course, again, is handled by the biome color, but we'll be able to hopefully improve this by either just changing the biome color or changing what is actually on the riverbed here in this biome. We'll get to that in a minute though. Let's talk about the environment attributes that I've selected and how I'm applying them across the dimension. Several of the environment attributes are just completely global. They are unchanging, and I've defined them in the dimension type. For example, the color of the clouds I've made black by just changing that in the dimension type file. Fog color, of course, can be controlled at the dimension level, but we're currently handling at the biome level. So right now, all of the biomes, or rather pretty much just the generic plains biome that I have right now, I guess, and then the river biome, are both using the same color for fog. The sky is a very, very deep purple. You may not quite be able to tell, but it's intended to be quite dark because we're supposed to have a sort of night sky here over these black clouds. But what you also may have been able to tell, in addition to our stationary moon that is always a full moon, unaffected by time, we also have the stars moving over time. Recently, Mojang has made quite a lot of environment attributes, as they're called, quite a lot of the aesthetic features that used to be controlled pretty much exclusively by the time of day and hard-coded to be configurable with a data pack, configurable with worldgen, with something called a timeline. So in the overworld, things like the moon and the sun are controlled by a timeline. Where they are in the sky is interpolated based on the time of day in the overworld. For this custom witch dimension, I've made it so that the moon is not affected by the timeline, and it always stays in that same position and at that same moon phase. It stays a full moon at all times because, of course, it isn't moving in the sky to ever be out of sight to change to a different phase. However, something that I don't believe Vanilla Overworld does, or at least not in a way that is really visible, is have the stars move based on the time of day. And I've done that pretty much the same way that the sun and moon normally do for the overworld. Rather than the moon moving, the stars move and rotate across the sky. This will create what I hope is a really mysterious, unnerving, magical effect. All of these factors together don't really make a lot of sense together. If this planet, if you could call it that, were stationary without an orbit but was rotating in the sky, obviously the moon and the stars would be rotating together, but they're not. The moon is stationary, which also means that this planet can't reasonably be orbiting the moon because the stars are moving. Ultimately, this should just feel very unnatural and magical, which is going to be a common theme through most of the decisions I make in this dimension, so I'll try to stop mentioning it. Now, what this also means, of course, is that it is eternal night. So like I mentioned earlier, I made it so that the light level here is always 15. So there is always direct skylight, direct moonlight that is making this dimension nice and bright. But I've also made it so that monsters are able to spawn at that level, specifically for witches, which again, I'm not sure that I'm going to actually have spawn at least at this frequency. Mob spawning, at least the specific mobs that are able to spawn, is handled at the biome level, and so right now I've just made it so that across the whole dimension, the generic biome that I have in use right now is only able to spawn witches as their monster, but I've also implemented something called a spawn costs. Spawn cost is something that is used very rarely in the vanilla world gen, specifically in the Nethers, Warped Forest, and Soul Sand Valley biomes, and it's basically just a way to space out mob spawns. It makes it so that any mobs that have a spawn cost basically say, okay, anywhere where I'm attempting to place a mob, where the world is attempting to spawn a new mob, it checks the charge level of that position, which is determined based on distance from any existing mobs of that type. So since witches have a spawn cost, anywhere where there is a witch, there is some kind of radius around them where if any mob attempts to spawn there, though of course currently that's only witches, then it's not going to be able to spawn. It's going to fail, or at least have a higher chance of failing due to that radius to that witch. So that way we can control the general spacing and frankly the frequency of at least witch spawns, if not all mob spawns across the dimension. So you won't get just completely swarmed by witches, but we don't want that to affect other mobs that we plan to spawn here either, as we determine once we start working on biomes, which I think it's probably about time for. Starting with the river biome, I think like I mentioned, I'll probably brighten up the watercolor just a little bit, but I of course still want it to stay this nice purpley, magenta-ish color, and we'll try to accentuate that a little bit more by making the riverbed made of primarily obsidian. It's a nice dark contrast block compared to the blackstone that's a little bit more neutral, especially on the top, which should hopefully help the color of the purple pop out a little bit more rather than mute it. And I think especially if we have the whole area be obsidian, but then we have some streaks of crying obsidian running through it, that'll just allow for even more opportunities for that color to really shine through. I also think it'll be really interesting to have some soul sand along the riverbed here so that we can have these bubble columns drifting up to the surface, just to kind of make it feel like the rivers are constantly bubbling in very much a different way than magma blocks would be able to accomplish, especially since magma blocks I think would give the wrong color theme to this biome. Soul sand is of course that nice bright brown compared to the obsidian, so it is still going to pop out, but I think that the effect of the upwards bubble column is going to kind of compensate for that. I'd also like for there to be some sugarcane all across the river, which unfortunately means probably needing to place some grass. Sand is obviously not going to fit in this dimension aesthetically, but grass I can at least change the color for. I'm pretty sure it's even going to change the color of the sugarcane as well. Technically, as of 26.1, I could add something like blackstone or obsidian even to the block tag that supports sugarcane so that sugarcane can grow on them, but I'd rather not do that because it's going to change expected behavior of blackstone that players get from elsewhere in the world, from the Nether in particular, that I don't really want to do for this particular project. We're not trying to change too much of existing gameplay and mechanics. We're just trying to add a new dimension here that has kind of its own parallel gameplay and mechanics. And so we're kind of locked into using the vanilla block behavior for this one. The reason I particularly want to include sugarcane is that ideally I think it'd be really interesting if all or at least most of the potion ingredients that you can make potions from were available somewhere in this dimension. And of course, sugarcane can be used to make sugar, which of course is used for potions of speed. I also feel like it's going to make a lot of sense for when we eventually start adding structures to this dimension so that there is a source of paper so that witches could have libraries, bookshelves in their respective structures. We'll also probably need a source of leather as well, which we'll figure out at some point. Now, I don't only want to do the rivers right now, I also would like to start to decorate the bulk of the dimension by defining what the main biome kind of is. Probably going to call it just plains for ease, but of course it's not going to look anything like the vanilla overworld's plains. Some might consider this a bit of a faux pas, but I think I would really love to incorporate some purple concrete in streaks, very similar to how we're doing the crying obsidian in the riverbed, that can kind of stream across the whole terrain of this biome, almost like that is the natural kind of arrangement of colors across the dimension. If the purple streaks are running through this plains, very much like rivers, it's going to feel a lot like the rivers that are running across the entire dimension. I'll probably incorporate some black concrete powder as well around the outside so that we can fade in from these purple concretes, gradient into the black concrete powder, and then back into the black stone. Now, of course, these are manufactured blocks, which is why this choice might be a little bit controversial, but you have to remember this is an unnatural dimension, potentially created by magic or at least found by magic, so I don't necessarily need it to follow the same rules that vanilla worldgen might need to, or might want to at least, to feel like a natural world. This is very much not meant to feel like a natural world. It is meant to be magical and strange and almost kind of alien. Also, it's just a fact that I want to use these colors for my worldgen, but we don't really have natural blocks that suit that. I could use something like amethyst, which of course is a natural block, but it's just much too bright. It doesn't create this nice, magical, deep purple that I'm looking for. And same with like the black concrete. We don't have anything that looks or behaves like this that isn't black concrete powder. So you're going to have to just accept the fantastical elements. Sorry, guys. I do think I'll probably incorporate amethyst here, probably by having some kind of like rooted trees that can be, again, not necessarily alien, but certainly otherworldly, probably with some roots to keep them stretching above the surface, and then some kind of a branching or forking trunk provider to make them look not necessarily intended to be like dead trees, but just kind of mysterious crystalline growths coming out of the surface. Of course, we'll probably get some trees in here too. Witches are associated with illagers. They'll participate in raids, so I feel like the dark oak isn't too out of place. We'll probably do something very similar to a regular dark oak tree that you might find in the dark oak forest, though maybe taking some inspiration from my forest update and using something like a cherry foliage provider instead of the regular dark oak provider, just to create a bit of a denser foliage. I think I'll probably do a forest biome in this dimension as well that'll probably use these same trees, so it'll be good to get a general idea and shape going here before we tackle that. Now, since I mentioned earlier, we're probably going to want a source of leather, I imagine we're probably going to want cows to be able to generate here, or some kind of animal at least. And so we are going to need some patches of grass. Again, thankfully I can change the color of grass here, but I'm probably going to take a page out of my book from the end update video that I did a while back and make it so that these patches of grass aren't able to generate along edges here, so that we don't get this brown dirt texture, which isn't necessarily ugly, but doesn't fit the rest of the dimension. I think that would just be very strange along the terrain here where the rest of it is blackstone. This will allow me to get some grasses and ferns, helping to add a little bit of texture to this biome since they can't be placed on blackstone or these concrete powders. And again, while I could add these blocks to a block tag to make that supported, I don't necessarily want to change that behavior as far as the overworld goes. So these are going to be our only means to have these just slightly 3D elements peppering the ground here. I do think, however, I want to incorporate leaf litter along the ground across much of the dimension, probably in almost all the biomes. Leaf litter is really nice because it has quite a lot of these block states to add a bit of 2D texture to the ground at least, not creating the same effect that short grass and ferns do to just add a little bit of dimension to the ground, but at least adding a little bit of different coloration, since we have 4 different rotations and 4 different quantities of leaves for every leaf litter block. I think that will create just some nice variety along the ground here, even accepting that it's going to look a little bit more interesting than this thanks to the noise pattern of the purple concrete and stuff here. What's really nice too is I'm pretty sure I can change the color of the leaf litter block on the ground, similar to leaves and grass, but to a different color than those, obviously since these are brown. Pretty sure that's a thing I can do. Let's check that out and then come back and see how this plains biome as well as the rivers ended up turning out. If you're enjoying the video, please remember to like and subscribe for more custom worldgen structures and data pack content. If you're excited to go into the Witch realm yourself, please consider joining my Patreon to get early access. I plan to release this as more features get added, and so until then, I'll greatly appreciate the playtesting help of my patrons. And to get into custom worldgen yourself, check the link in the description for my very thorough written guide that I've made for Data Pack Hub, where I am an official helper. Oh yeah, this is looking so cool. This just completely changes the aesthetic, the vibe of this dimension as soon as you enter it. Fantastic. So starting here in the plains, we obviously have this noise pattern of the purple concrete, again fading into the black concrete powder, and then into the regular blackstone. I'm handling this surface here using vegetation patches that are placed across every chunk in the biome, and then are using a noise state provider for their ground state to change the blocks that they are changing blackstone into this noise pattern here. Technically, it should be possible to at least get pretty close to this design, this noise pattern for the ground using surface rules, but I find vegetation patches to be just a little bit more accessible. They give a little bit greater degree of control over the frequency, the size, and in particular, the pattern of the noise here, and are also, at least as I understand it, quite a bit more performant than surface rules are. The purple concrete streaks are doing a lot to break up the blackstone of the terrain here and make it look just not quite as gray, but I think what is doing a lot of the heavy lifting is of course the leaf litter on the ground here, which I was able to change to this beautiful iridescent purple color. These are of course being placed by a simple block feature that just is able to randomly select between all of the different block states for the leaf litter so that we get this nice hodgepodge of different quantities, different rotations of the leaf litter. And then each of those placement attempts is just getting spread around the chunk a number of times determined by my count so that I can control roughly how often they're able to appear within a given chunk. And then we just project that up to a height map. This is the standard method now for placing individual blocks, even randomized individual blocks, compared to placing larger patches like, of course, how we're handling the purple concrete here, or the patches of grass that I have spreading around a small origin point here. These are just additional vegetation patches that are getting placed after the main vegetation patch that covers the surface, which itself is placing a vegetation feature to place yet another simple block on top of any of those grass blocks to have the short and tall grass. I am quite satisfied with the verticality that these amethyst trees or growths here are adding. Again, they don't necessarily look like dead trees. I think the choice of block helps a lot with that, and they help brighten up the horizon a little bit and extend the horizon a little bit compared to a very flat dimension, a very flat plains that we would have otherwise. I've also made it so that if their roots extend into purple concrete or black concrete powder, they're able to continue to extend and turn into either gilded blackstone or glowstone, again, so we can have more of those potion ingredients naturally generating throughout the world. And then in addition to these dark oak trees, which pretty much turned out exactly as I expected, again, we're using a dark oak trunk provider here, cherry foliage placer, and giving them some roots just so they look a little bit more gnarled down here. We also have these small dark oak bushes that are pretty common throughout the ground. This isn't for any gameplay reason specifically, it's just because, particularly again, without the short and tall grass being able to cover most of the dimension, it just felt particularly flat. We didn't have the texturing that I wanted because the leaf litter is of course 2D, and so these really help break up the low part of the horizon and make it feel just a little bit more kind of vegetated and three-dimensional, textured. Something else that was really fun to get to work on is these custom bewitched cows that I was able to add. This is fully vanilla. These cows are just a new cow variant, similar to the warm and cold cows. When they added the warm and cold cows, and as well as warm and cold chickens, warm and cold pigs, etc., they made it so that data packs and resource packs could add their own custom variants with their own custom spawning conditions. And so I've made it so that when cows spawn in any of the Witch Realm dimensions, on grass of course, thanks to the high light level added by the dimension's environment attributes, then they become this bewitched cow variant. Now that part is automatic and handled by the cal variant definition file, but what isn't automatic, unfortunately, is a ticking function that makes it so that these bewitched cows have a name that you can see, because I felt like that would be useful for players to see, okay, that's why this cow looks different, it's bewitched. This ticking function also changes the drops of the cow so that instead of dropping raw beef and leather, it drops raw beef and bewitched leather, which is just a leather item that has a different item model to look a little closer to the bewitched cow's skin. It also has enchantment glue because I thought that'd be fun. Because it's just reskinned leather, this bewitched leather doesn't actually have any unique use yet. That's probably something that I will add as we develop more of the gameplay for this dimension. That about covers the bulk of the plains. Let's head into the river and see how that ended up turning out. One thing that I really like, I don't, again, like or want any of the exposed dirt here from the grass blocks. If players break the blocks and are able to see that, that's not the end of the world. But as they're walking around an untouched dimension, I don't want them to be able to see that dirt texture. But here in the river, of course, it's pretty unavoidable because we need the grass blocks to be adjacent to water for the sugarcane to survive. But they add a really interesting effect to the edge of the river, to this shore here, almost making it kind of glow on its own. I don't have night vision on right now. I don't have my shaders on right now. So this just creates a very interesting effect along the edge of the river that I actually really, really like. Let's find a little bit of a wider section of the river so we can get a better look at, that crying obsidian that we can see streaking through the obsidian ground. Because the obsidian is so dark but does have just that slight purple hue to it, it, I think, really helps the purple water texture, or what's really closer to a magenta now, pop quite a bit more than it was before. It doesn't look quite as dulled thanks to having blackstone behind it, this gray color. The obsidian is being handled by a surface rule because that makes up the bulk of the terrain, the bulk of the block that I want the riverbed to be made of, but the crying obsidian is being handled by discs that I'm placing all throughout the river biome, rather than vegetation patches, because vegetation patches actually cannot be placed underwater. They just completely failed to place, so I had to use disc spam instead. But since it's such a small area, it doesn't really have an impact on performance compared to the vegetation patch method that we're able to use above the water. All the disc is doing is using a noise-based state provider to replace most of the obsidian with obsidian, except where the noise is a particular value, in which case it creates these nice streaks of the crying obsidian. All of the soul sand is being placed by a simple block feature that I'm again just kind of randomly spreading using a rarity filter to control how often they're able to attempt to generate in each chunk. And then thankfully the simple block feature is able to perform a block update during worldgen, so that allows us to get the bubble column pretty much right away. I think this dimension is starting to come along really well. We have what is ultimately going to be the most common biome across the dimension, but we certainly will need to add some more. Before that though, I think I'd like to start to figure out how the player is going to enter this dimension. These are what I'm going to call ruined sigils. The idea is that they're going to generate in the overworld very similar to ruined portals as kind of your clue for how to build a portal, or in this case, a sigil, to get to the Witch Realm. You'll be able to access the Witch Realm from anywhere, but the ruined sigils will provide many of the resources as well as the exact shape that you need to create with those blocks in order to get there. We have a few variants here that, like ruined portals, are going to generate in a few different biomes. So we've got this stone brick one that's going to be kind of the default. That's what will generate in things like plains or forests or something. We have the sandstone one that'll be for deserts and badlands. A prismarine one, which I think will be really cool to generate in the oceans. And then a cobblestone and deep slate one that'll be used primarily in jungles and probably swamps as well. All of these are going to have a processor applied to them to slightly ruin them. Specifically, I'll probably make it so that the campfires have a chance to be put out, that the stone bricks have a chance to get replaced with cracked stone bricks or mossy stone bricks, sandstone with sand, prismarine with prismarine bricks, and of course cobblestone with mossy cobblestone. You may also notice we have a bunch of jigsaw blocks underneath all of them. These are going to generate a worldgen feature, a block column that will extend downward until they hit the ground. That way, if something like a stone brick sigil, or especially like an ocean sigil, generates on a hill or above the sea level, which is my plan for this one, then we can have some blocks extending downwards to the ground so that they are clearly supported, and explains how they were built there, rather than just floating randomly or being on a weird, like, hovering floating island with bearding. This jigsaw block in the middle of each of these is going to get replaced with a netherrack block when the jigsaw block generates, and then is going to generate this small structure, which serves as the actual sigil. The witch here is going to be saved with the structure, and so should spawn as part of the generation for these structures. I've made it immobile using this repeating command block so that it has a high level of slowness for 1 second. So as soon as it's outside of this world or that command block turns off or something, it'll go back to normal behavior. My plan is to create a predicate to use in some kind of advancement that can check for if a set of redstone wire and specifically lit candles of any quantity or color is placed in this configuration to trigger the portal opening for the Witch Realm. I'll use a processor to replace some of the redstone wire with air so that it is slightly ruined, and same, I'll use a processor to replace some of these candles with lit candles, some of them with different quantities of candles, but also some of them with air so that you don't always have a completed sigil here. But this shelf will always be here up against that block right there to give you kind of the rest of the clues that you need. So it'll have the honeycomb to kind of signify the candles that you'll need to craft if you need to, and then we have an iron ingot and flint to help indicate that you'll need to use some flint and steel to light the candles. The advancement trigger I'll probably use is the any block use trigger that checks if you've used flint and steel on a block of fire or to create a block of fire, and the netherrack will serve as the indicator that that's what you need to do. Let's get these generating in the overworld, and then I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about and how it's all going to work. Alright, so here is one of those ruined sigils, and we can already see the processors at play. Only 2 of the campfires are lit. We have a mix of stone bricks and mossy stone bricks, including for the walls, but most especially for the actual solid stone brick ground. And then we also have the block columns that are getting placed by those jigsaw blocks extending down to the ground. Looks like they're getting stuck on the seagrass and also the gravel. I think I'd rather them actually go through the gravel and the seagrass in particular. So I'll need to adjust the block tag for that in order to get that behaving how I want. But in general, we do have the support structure that we want for this generic ruin sigil. And then we also have the processor being applied to the redstone wire and the candles here. You can see we're missing what looks like 1, 2, 3 of the redstone wires, and then some of these candles are lit, or one of these candles is lit. 2 of them, 1 of them is missing right over there, and the rest of them have different quantities of unlit candles. Again, you'll be able to use any color and any quantity of candles to activate a sigil. The only thing that matters is if they are lit, and of course if they are in those respective positions. And then we have the witch, of course, which wandered away over there, but it did spawn, which is good. Let's go ahead and place another candle over here to complete the sigil, light all these candles, and we can see how the predicate ends up working. So right now, this is a completed sigil. If I break this redstone wire and try to light this netherrack, nothing is going to happen. Same thing if I break this candle, then it's not going to work. If we place it back but don't light it, still nothing. But as soon as I light it, now the predicate that I've made that checks if all this redstone wire and all these lit candles are in this configuration is true, which means that when I trigger the advancement by using a flint and steel to create fire right here, it triggers that advancement and we start to get this awesome particle animation. I'm using a scoreboard timer to count up. We have a marker entity placed in the middle there, and then as that scoreboard timer increases, then different particle effects start to occur, different sound effects occur, until finally we get that awesome blast of black smoke of squid ink, and then all the candles get broken. We were not inside of the circle of purple particles that was being projected, and so we did not get teleported to the Witch Realm. But if you were inside of that circle, then you would get teleported there. The candles get broken, but they aren't completely destroyed, so you are able to reuse the same sigil over and over again. You just have to go through the effort to replace all the candles and, of course, most importantly, relight them. This means that unlike a nether portal, travel to and from the Witch Realm is not continuously open. It's more like a one-time effect, or at least a one-time per use effect to travel there, almost like you're entering a dream. And like I mentioned, the idea is that you could build this sigil anywhere. So if you found a ruined sigil really far away from your base and you'd like to be able to travel to the Witch Realm whenever you want without needing to travel there, that's no problem. You can just set up a sigil of your own wherever you happen to be. You don't even need the netherrack as long as you light all the candles. The only thing that matters is if you light a fire in the middle of the sigil, and that will start to trigger the animation. You can't trigger another one while one is going because the fire's already here, and there's a marker entity to prevent it even further. But if we go ahead and switch to third person mode, we can see those purple particles and see how it takes us into the Witch Realm. Now, as you can see, now that we've traveled here, we don't have a ruined sigil to return with. I haven't really quite decided exactly how I want players to be able to return to the overworld from the Witch Realm, but I do have a general idea of how I want players to engage with the Witch Realm. My hope is that the Witch Realm's progression, whatever gameplay loop it offers, can kind of work in parallel with standard Minecraft progression, and specifically as kind of an every so often excursion. So as soon as you get access to the Witch Realm, as soon as you have the resources to build a sigil, you go to the Witch Realm, you do something there, something of importance, gather a specific resource or some resources that you want, and then you return to the overworld until later, until you realize there's something else in the Witch Realm that would be interesting to go and get. I can't necessarily enforce that super duper hard, nor would I specifically want to. But I want the design of the travel and return mechanics, and of course whatever kind of goals and resources are available to be collected here, to kind of align with that intent, at least, to incentivize engaging with the Witch Realm in that way. So I'll have to think a little bit more on exactly how I want that implemented, but until then, we at least have a way to travel to the Witch Realm, which I think is great. For now though, I'd like to start working on some other biomes for the dimension. I have this area cordoned off here for a separate biome from the plains. The plains I still want to be the primary biome here and is in this kind of flatter, kind of hilly terrain. I think I'd like, of course, the plateaus, the mesas over there, to be their own specific biome, and same for like the really tall mountains that I think are off in that direction-ish. But for this area right here that is also similarly flat-ish and hilly like the plains, I'd like a different biome to help kind of break it up a little bit. Probably the forest I was thinking about earlier. I think we'll probably incorporate some more grass than is present in the plains, just to kind of feel a little bit more kind of overgrown and natural compared to the plains, which is much more clearly magical and unnatural. Because it's a forest, of course, we'll probably still incorporate a lot of those same trees that we have out in the plains, just in much greater quantities. I want to create a nice, thick canopy, not too dissimilar from like a vanilla dark oak forest, but probably even thicker than that, especially with the foliage. We'll use that cherry foliage provider again to really space things out and make it really nice and thick. But I do want the trees to be nice and tall so that you're able to walk around in there without bumping your head too much. We'll still incorporate the roots, I'm sure, to make them feel a little bit more gnarled and uneasy, but it'll still feel like a just more intricate dark oak forest. Now for the color scheme for this biome, we already have a nice deep purple here. I think I'd like for the woods, the forest here, to be a little bit more blue. So we'll probably use some blue terracotta for the ground here. We'll of course change the grass and the foliage color to be a nice kind of dark blue. Not necessarily navy, I think, but just kind of a, dark, dulled, mysterious blue color, which I think will contrast really well with the leaf litter that I think will have a nice iridescent, almost bright blue, similar to how we have the leaf litter in the plains as this much brighter kind of, again, iridescent is really the best word for it, this very bright purple, even compared to a certain extent to the purple concrete here. Let's also go ahead and start thinking about how we want to fill these plateaus. This is a really nice plateau region, so I think it'll be really great to see how it all comes together here. Once again, I want to incorporate some leaf litter here, and I'm thinking that we'll have the color scheme for the plateaus be more of a red, just this really harsh, almost hostile, aggressive environment as you enter the plateaus, which I think will fit really well with the kind of stark and sheer cliffs that we've got here. We'll of course incorporate some red concrete powder and red concrete, again, those kind of unnatural manufactured blocks to create the feeling that I want across the whole plateaus. Again, using the vegetation patch trick that I'm using for the plains down there. However, unlike the plains and probably the woods as well, I think it would be really cool to have the streaks be blackstone, have blackstone be the thing that is a little bit less common and streaky through the terrain, and have it be flanked by large sections, large kind of almost boulders or plates of red concrete and red concrete powder fading into one another. While I am of course aware that we have plenty of natural red blocks in the form of netherrack and crimson nylium and things, I really specifically want to avoid making this biome or anything in this dimension feel like a biome that already exists, feel like a dimension that already exists. I want to avoid making this the nether biome, you know? And so using some unnatural blocks, particularly blocks that do appear elsewhere in the dimension, at least as far as the material that they're made of, will help provide some consistency, some theming to the whole dimension. I think we'll also have some trees here, probably going to use mangrove logs, or specifically stripped mangrove logs, so that we get and maintain that nice reddish color all across here. I'm pretty sure mangrove leaves can be recolored. This looks like a quite bright green compared to what you typically find in the mangrove swamps, which does seem to suggest that it will obey whatever foliage color I define in the biome. So once again, we'll probably make that a nice bright red. I'd also really love to have redstone be accessible here, have some like surface redstone deposits so you don't need to go mining for it. Again, because this is a potion ingredient, I think it'll work really, really well. I'm thinking probably using a spike feature, since that creates a really cool surface shape that should add some awesome verticality in addition to these trees, which actually, now that I'm looking at it, I'm not sure if I like this straight trunk provider that I'm imagining here. Maybe something more like a cherry trunk provider would work a little better, so that we get these kind of, again, alien looking right angle branches that can have their own leaves hanging off them. I think that'll work really well. Probably still going to use an acacia foliage provider for that, because it has that association with acacia trees, which are found in savannas, so it'll work really well to create that sensation of warmness as you are exploring this plateau biome, which will be aided by all the red colors. But back to the spikes, I obviously don't want them to be made entirely out of redstone blocks. For one, that would be too valuable, and for two, kind of ugly. So I'll probably use a noise state provider so that I can have it fade from redstone blocks to deep slate redstone ore, and then probably ultimately to deep slate, which I don't actually have in my hand right now. And then probably ultimately to deep slate, which will stand out a little bit. It's a little bit more gray than I was hoping for, but I think will help and work really well with the gradient, the transition, to help the redstone feel a little bit more at home. That was kind of a lot of ideas. Let's see if we can actually execute on any of them. All right, we've got a good amount to look at here. We obviously have this small wooded section here between the plains and the plateaus, which we'll get to in a moment. Let's start here in the wooded biome. These trees will probably be familiar to anybody who's seen my forest update video. They are very similar to the fancy oak trees that I use in the regular forest there. But of course, they've been changed to dark oak and dark oak leaves rather than the oak trees that I used there. I've also added a decorator to them so that they have some vines attached to their leaves to make this not necessarily feel like a jungle, but a much more overgrown forest. One other thing that is perhaps a bit of a subtle detail you might be able to pick up on. So right now we can see pretty good distance away, probably about render distance, about 12 chunks. But as we enter into the woods, that gets reduced quite a bit to something probably closer to 8 chunks. And that's of course because fog distance is an environment attribute. It's one we were already using as it is used in the nether, but it can also be influenced at the biome level. And so I've made it so that while you're in this woods biome, the fog starts much closer to you. This is to help create a very claustrophobic sensation as you're walking around the woods biomes, even when they're small, by making it appear that they go on for much longer than they actually do. We obviously have quite a few areas where the trees are close enough and the canopies are wide enough that we get some pretty intense darkness, I would say. But then we have other areas that are just a little bit more open just due to the natural way that the trees happen to have spaced themselves out. As mentioned, we of course have grass blocks as one of the blocks that is able to be used for the noise-based state provider that the vegetation patch is placing for its ground state, and that allows us to have some ferns, again very similar to my forest update video. However, we're also using that rule-based state provider so that anywhere we have these ledges, we're getting blackstone so as to avoid getting any of that grass. And specifically, of course, the exposed dirt. The leaves here are an iridescent blue, and while they are being placed by a simple block feature, I'm also handling them a little bit differently than those in some of the other biomes so far. You'll notice there are some wide areas over here where there is no leaf litter. That's not because it's being blocked by the trees or anything like that. It's because I'm using a noise-based count placement modifier to place these so that we get large areas where there's quite a bit of leaves, and then somewhat smaller areas where there aren't any at all. The general idea is to create a somewhat similar sensation to the ground coverage itself, the surface, making it feel like the leaves are forming a path through the woods, even though of course that isn't actually what's happening. All these trees have roots which have a chance to place either red or brown mushrooms on top of them, which can sometimes generate inside of the trunk, which is quite silly because we're using such large trunks. Roots don't really behave with the large trunk placers like they do with the single wide trunk placers, but I think that ends up working all right here, especially because, like we talked about in the plains, it makes this biome and the trees in specific feel more gnarled and unnatural in how overgrown and natural they are. Let's come back out of the woods and get our fog distance back to normal as we fly over to the plateaus that I believe were off this way. And I think of all the biomes that I've made so far, this one nails that color scheme idea the best. We have so much red here on the ground that feels like it belongs. We're using, again, that same vegetation patch trick, that same noise-based state provider trick, but we've just kind of swapped which blocks are the most common and which blocks only appear at those very low noise values. The blackstone is now what gets turned into the streaks and cracks between all of what I've actually gone with red terracotta to create a little bit of a better contrast and gradient from the blackstone to the red concrete powder, which I have stuck with. We also have many more patches of grass here up on the plateaus compared to the plains, as well as these small ponds and puddles, which are being created with a waterlogged vegetation patch feature. I'm a fan of the shape in particular of waterlogged vegetation patch features compared to using something like a lake, which does work really well for lakes and for ponds, but for smaller ponds and puddles like this, I find the shapes of vegetation patches and discs to be a little bit easier to control. However, I have kept the simple block feature that I'm using for the rivers down there so that we still have some soul sand blocks in these puddles to add some bubble columns. The trees turned out, I think, pretty excellent. Like I said, I'm using the acacia foliage placer, even though these are mangrove leaves, because it creates that warm savanna sensation just by the shape. It creates that implication. I was gonna wait to talk about them, but they're kind of all up in your face, huh? These are the new bewitched frogs, a new frog variant that is being handled the same way as the cow variants down in the plains. The only thing that the variant is actually doing is changing the skin here and saying that whenever a frog does spawn in the witch realm, then it gets this particular skin. All of their other behavior you see here, including their size, is being handled by a ticking function that's just checking, similar to the cows, every time a bewitched frog spawns for the first time and applies those changes to it, as well as a tag so that it doesn't get checked again. This increases its scale, gives it that name so players know what it's called, and also makes it start projecting these particles. The particles are meant to indicate that this frog is dry, that it is out of water, with the goal being to get it back into the water. If we go ahead and spawn one over here, it'll very quickly go to its full size, and you'll see that it's no longer, well, now I've walked out of the water. You'll see that it's no longer emitting those particles as it's kind of swimming around in this little pond here. I'm using bewitched frogs as the main way to acquire netherwort here in the witch realm, again so that we can have most potion ingredients accessible, at least as a final goal. Every 5 seconds, a bewitched frog that is in water has a chance to spawn between 1 and 3 netherwort items, which will just kind of pop out of it for you to collect either with hoppers or just by hand. It's not necessarily meant to be a particularly efficient netherwort farm. Certainly it is far better to just grow some on soul sand normally, but this is meant to serve primarily as a reasonable in-universe method that netherwort might have been attained by the witches that live or created this place. Shifting gears back away from the frogs though, we obviously have these spikes that cannot be ignored. I think the noise-based pattern from deep slate to redstone ore to the redstone blocks ends up working very well. The redstone blocks still obviously feel very raw, very processed and unnatural, but having them kind of built into these spikes that are more natural blocks, I think ends up helping to alleviate that dissonance some. Now, normally the spike feature does not accept a block state provider. You can only provide a single block state that the entire spike gets made out of. So for this particular feature, they're normally just made out of deep slate. How I'm handling this noise-based pattern is the same way that I'm handling the ground or the riverbed in the river biome. I'm spamming a bunch of disks to replace all deep slate that it finds with that noise-based state provider of deep slate, redstone ore, and redstone blocks. And this ends up working quite seamlessly while also, again, not being too heavy on performance. In addition to drawing attention to the leaf litter, the color for which I've gone a little bit darker, a little bit less iridescent than some of the other biomes, because I felt that this contrasted nicely not only with the blackstone still, we still have these sort of brighter leaves as part of the texture, but especially with the red concrete powder and the red terracotta. I'll make note of the lit redstone wire that you can find on the ground around many of these trees. Obviously, redstone is already accessible here thanks to the spikes, but this I felt was a fun additional detail, almost like these trees are made of redstone and they are sprouting or dropping or growing these roots or leaves or fruit of redstone wire that lands on the ground and is lit until you grab it and it starts to update the surrounding blocks. This is mostly an unnecessary detail that I thought was just fun to include, but it does help illustrate the issue of contrast, why the leaf litter here is darker compared to this lit redstone wire that almost you can you can see it on these brighter red blocks, but it doesn't serve the same aesthetic as it does on the blackstone. And the same is true for the leaves. The leaves aren't necessarily super duper bright against the blackstone, but they do contrast with it at least some, but they especially provide a nice contrast with the bulk of the ground here. We can also compare the density of leaf litter in the Plateaus biome to the plains. The plains, it's a little bit more stringy, it's kind of strewn around, but it still covers much of the ground. It's still a dominant part of the environment, whereas in the Plateaus, it is just covering it. The ground is caked in the leaves. Basically, I've just increased the count for the leaf litter feature in this particular biome. I've also thought a little bit more about how I expect players to leave the Witch Realm, and the main way that I want to not necessarily enforce, that's not the right word for it, but for lack of a better word, enforce or incentivize or just kind of codify the idea of needing to come to the Witch Realm and then leave after you finished your business and come back at a later time. And the manner for which I've decided to do that is by making you only be able to stay in the Witch Realm for a limited amount of time. Specifically, you can stay in the Witch Realm for about 30 minutes, and as that time counts down, you'll receive messages to help indicate that your time is running low, specifically at about 20 minutes, when you have 10 minutes left, 5 minutes left, 2 minutes, there's that 20-minute timer now, and ultimately at 10 seconds left. Each of these messages gets more and more imperative, suggesting that you can only stay in the Witch Realm for so long before the overworld pulls you back. Again, almost like using the sigil brought you to some kind of dream state. This timer only counts down while you're in survival mode, so I can fly around as much as I want in creative, but once I switch back to survival, then we'll see pretty shortly here, the overworld is starting to embrace me. I've got about 10 seconds left before I'm finally teleported back to where I started in the overworld, where I created that sigil. The chunks for which have been reset, so my sigil isn't here anymore, but of course the ruined sigil that's down here still is. Let's just go ahead and relight this here, watch the cool animation, and then head back into the Witch Realm. So ultimately what this means is you use a sigil, you enter the Witch Realm, you enter this kind of dream state area, you can explore it as much as you want for about 30 minutes, and then you'll be taken back to exactly where you left, almost as though you never left. Now this does lead me into talking about the at least temporary purpose that I have found for bewitched leather. So let me see if I can find one of these bewitched cows. Here we go. So when you grab some bewitched leather, you'll find that you get a new recipe for a witch hat. The recipe requires 6 leather plus an emerald, but if you click on the witch hat, you'll find that bewitched leather does count, since of course it is just reskinned leather. You can craft the hat, go ahead and equip it, and I think it looks pretty cute. The witch hat itself doesn't really have any behavior, at least for now, but what it does do is prevent your personal timer in the witch realm from counting down, which means as long as you're wearing a witch hat, you can stay in the witch realm for as long as you want, essentially forcing participation in witchcraft, which I think is very fun. I'm sure at some point I'll come up with some more usage for this item, at least give it some different stats, maybe it gives you some protection from magic, not sure yet, but at minimum, it allows you to engage with the Witch Realm for as long as you want by engaging with the Witch Realm, by collecting some bewitched leather. Now, of course, ultimately when you do want to leave the Witch Realm, that does mean that you would have to take off your witch hat and potentially wait 30 minutes. So to help alleviate that, I have added one additional feature. I've added a 5th variant of the Ruined Sigil, which, very similar to the Ruined Portals that you find in the Nether, serve as your potential exit point from the Witch Realm back to the overworld, or at least an exit point that was used in the past. It follows all the same rules as far as the processor that gets applied to the sigil and to the structure, the block column feature and everything, and it's just made of assorted blackstone blocks. But the campfires are soul fire instead of regular fire, which I thought was a fun detail. If you repair a ruined sigil here in the Witch Realm or create another sigil of your own here, it will trigger the exact same animation and take you back to the overworld, back to the location that you entered the Witch Realm from, your previous sigil, where you can find the candles that broke when you entered the Witch Realm. And so ultimately, there is no reason that you can't exit the Witch Realm whenever you want. And since redstone is available in the Plateaus, and you could gather candles from multiple ruined sigils, if not all the candles are present at one given ruined sigil, there should be no reason that as long as you have a flint and steel, you can't exit the Witch Realm whenever you like. Of course, currently there isn't a lot of reason to want to stay in the Witch Realm, but that'll come with more updates as we add more structures and things. Before that though, we need a source of emeralds so that players can actually craft the witch hat here. Which means I think it's time to start working on the final biome that we have kind of mapped out, the mountains here. I'm thinking a green color scheme for the mountains so that it makes sense for emeralds to be found here. The emeralds themselves will probably be placed by a spike-like feature, but probably not using the same spikes that I did for the Plateaus, because I don't want it to be too samey to that biome. I'll probably use the same spikes that I made in the Wastes, which of course I learned how to make from the Incendium data pack, which uses them in the Toxic Heat biome. I think I also want some spruce trees here, since witches do also have an association with spruce, so I want this wood type to be available. I don't particularly love the color here, at least as far as like the natural bark, but I think the strip bark would also not necessarily work, so it's probably going to be fine. Unfortunately, spruce leaves are color locked. They do not obey the color tinting for a particular biome's foliage color, so I'm probably going to forego use of them at all and instead just use more dark oak leaves. This does mean that spruce saplings aren't going to be renewable in this dimension, at least not from the worldgen itself. Maybe that's something that we'll try to solve for once we start adding some structures. I think I'll probably make these trees use a mix of pine foliage placers, spruce foliage placers, well that's a blob, and maybe make some mega spruce and pine tree variants as well, just to feel like they belong here on the mountains. Ooh, the black clouds going through, Ooh, the black clouds going through the mountains here look really cool. Look at that witch, she's just like floating on the sky. We'll of course have leaf litter, which I think I'll probably make an iridescent green once again, as this biome will also have blackstone be its dominant block, but I still want to incorporate those kind of unnatural blocks as we've been doing. Probably going to do streaks of lime concrete powder. I think that'll look really like toxic almost, which will fit really well with the kind of toxic green that the foliage will likely be, and works very nicely with the emerald color of the spikes that'll be found all around here. We'll use lime terracotta to fade into the blackstone so that it doesn't feel too high of contrast, too out of place, potentially hurting your eyes. I will also probably slightly change the octaves and the scale for the noise that I use for the surface here compared to biomes like the plains and the woods, just to help it feel a little bit different in pattern compared to those biomes, even though the colors will be doing a lot of that heavy lifting too. Let's see how that all comes together. Now this is awesome. Feels like something straight out of Wicked. The leaf litter is adding so much here, more I think than even any of the other biomes. The iridescent or even more toxic green, frankly, works very, very well here. Still providing some nice contrast, a little bit darker than the lime concrete powder and the lime terracotta, but especially nice at this high density against the blackstone, using the same feature here that I am for the plateaus. For the spikes, I opted to go with basalt for the bulk of the blocks here rather than deep slate to match with the deep slate emerald ore, because I feel like it wasn't too far off color-wise and created a little bit more of a vertical appearance, which fits this particular shape of spike much better. This spike feature, like I mentioned, I learned from looking at the Incendium data pack, and it's basically just a vegetation patch that gets placed in the same spot multiple times, each time it gets placed using a vegetation feature to place a block column that has a combination of rule-based state providers that are set up so that it only gets taller if it has enough nearby neighbors, which creates this nice kind of slope here. I am using a noise-based state provider for each of those block columns, so in theory we get some thin streaks of emerald. I've made it a very low chance, and then most of it is this basalt. So you tend to find emerald ore near emerald ore, and then the rest of these spikes is that just regular basalt. The spruce wood, I am grateful, actually works really well with all the greens. It provides a nice warmness that is otherwise lacking, but also doesn't feel out of place, even in these areas where we have several of the trees nearby in close proximity. It's a beautiful kind of complementary color with these more toxic greens that we see covering much of the rest of the biome, and indeed from the leaves here. Now, because we're using the vegetation patch trick for the surface, just like all the other biomes, it doesn't necessarily create the exact same level of coverage due to how hilly and extreme and cliff-like jagged these mountains are. So although, if you're looking from above, it's very clear that we are covering the whole of the surface, we have some areas where the vegetation patch gets kind of stretched out vertically, where it tries to go down as deep as it can, and we get these kind of weird clumps of the lime concrete powder and the lime terracotta that we otherwise wouldn't get, at least not this vertically, because the plains and woods and stuff, the ground there is not cut into slices quite as visibly as we're seeing here. Like we have this huge, like practically a shoulder right here that would look totally different if viewed only from above, if it was completely flat. But because we have so much more of the cliff exposed like this, it does create a very different appearance, but not, I think, a terrible one. If anything, it helps it stand out from some of the other biomes. With the mountain biome complete, I would say the worldgen portion of the Witch Realm is largely finished. I'm very happy with the biome variety that we have and the general availability of resources that I deem critically important to creating the feel and sensation of exploring a magical dimension. However, I am far from done. This project very quickly ballooned out of proportion to be able to fit in a single video, and so I hope that you will stick around for future Witch Realm videos where I plan to add all kinds of unique and magical structures filled with things like bookshelves crafted from the sugarcane that you find here, more potion ingredients, and in particular some custom bosses that I have really cool ideas for. Remember to like and subscribe for more custom worldgen, structures, and data pack content. To start learning how to get into custom worldgen, check the link in the description for my very thorough written guide. And to support the channel, get early access to the Witch Realm data pack, and participate in NPC fights like this one at the end of every video, please consider joining my Patreon. Congratulations to today's winner, Drago the Best, and Thanks for watching!